Jim Cornette looked straight into the camera and said the words that shocked the wrestling world. I hated him, but that wasn't just about one wrestler. That was about 10 different people who made his blood boil over decades in the business. Today, we're counting down every single one of them, and trust me, the reasons will blow your mind. Jim Cornette is wrestling royalty. He's been a manager, a booker, a commentator, and most importantly, a guardian of what he calls real wrestling. For over 40 years, he's fought to keep the business legitimate, believable, and respectful. But along the way, he made enemies, lots of them. Some deserved his hatred, some didn't, but all of them became part of wrestling history because of the wars they had with Cornette. This isn't just a list of guys he didn't like. These are blood feuds, career-ending battles, legal nightmares, physical threats, and ideological wars that continue to this day. From backstage slapping incidents to actual restraining orders, from gun threats to public humiliation, Cornette's hatred runs deep and it runs personal. We're going to walk through all 10 feuds in order, starting with the personal betrayals and building up to the biggest nemesis of them all. Each story reveals something darker about the wrestling business and about Cornette himself. By the end, you'll understand why Cornette's hatred isn't just emotion, it's strategy, it's business, it's survival. So let's dive in. Number 10, Nick Dinsmore. We start with heartbreak. Nick Dinsmore, known to WWE fans as Eugene, was one of Cornette's own students. Back in Ohio Valley Wrestling, Cornette trained him, guided him, and watched him succeed. They were close. They were friends. They had history together that spanned years. For a long time, everything was fine between them. Then politics got in the way. Dinsmore made a choice that Cornette couldn't forgive. He publicly supported Donald Trump and the Republican Party. That was it. That was the breaking point. Cornette, who is fiercely liberal and outspoken about his political beliefs, saw this as a moral failure. In his mind, supporting Trump wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a betrayal of basic human decency and values. So Cornette cut him off completely. He stopped talking to Dinsmore. He publicly shamed him on his podcast. He made it clear that their friendship was over because of politics. Cornette even said that anyone who votes Republican lacks moral responsibility. That's a heavy accusation to throw at someone you once considered a friend and student. Think about what that means. This wasn't about wrestling. This wasn't about money or creative differences or backstage drama. This was purely ideological. Cornette drew a line in the sand and said that crossing it meant losing his friendship forever. This feud shows how far Cornette's standards extend beyond the wrestling ring. It's not just about wrestling anymore. It's about ideology. It's about loyalty to a complete worldview. If you don't align with Cornette's beliefs on politics, society, and morality, you're out. Even if you were once family, even if he helped build your career. The Dinsmore situation reveals something important about modern Cornette. He's expanded his criteria for hatred beyond the business itself. Now it includes how you vote, what you believe, and what you stand for outside the ring. That makes him more complex, but also more rigid. There's no room for disagreement in Cornette's world. You're either with him completely or you're against him entirely. Number 9, Joey Ryan. Joey Ryan was everything Cornette despises about modern wrestling wrapped into one person. His entire gimmick revolved around his penis. Yes, you read that right. He performed a move called the penis plex, where he would somehow flip opponents using his groin area. Crowds laughed. Promoters booked him. Independent shows featured him prominently. And Jim Cornette lost his mind watching it happen. For Cornette, this wasn't funny. It was disgusting. It was an insult to the business he dedicated his entire life to preserving. Wrestling is supposed to be a combat sport, even if it's scripted. It's supposed to look real. It's supposed to have dignity and believability. Joey Ryan threw all of that away for cheap laughs and viral moments. Cornette called Ryan's act repulsive, embarrassing, and vulgar. He said it represented the worst of modern wrestling, proof that the business had become a complete joke. While Cornette can tolerate violence and blood if it's presented seriously and within the context of a real fight, sexualized comedy crosses a line he refuses to accept under any circumstances. Think about Cornette's perspective for a moment. He grew up in an era where wrestlers protected kayfabe with their lives. They stayed in character in public. They made people believe wrestling was real. They treated it like a sacred trust between performer and audience. Then along comes Joey Ryan, turning the whole thing into a literal dick joke. Ryan became a symbol. He represented everything wrong with independent wrestling in Cornette's eyes. The gimmick, the lack of respect for tradition, the willingness to sacrifice believability for viral moments and social media attention. Cornette hated him not just as a person, but as a concept. Ryan was the embodiment of everything Cornette fought against. the hatred was also moral. Cornette viewed the gimmick as crossing boundaries of basic decency. It wasn't edgy, it wasn't boundary pushing, it was just crude and offensive. And the fact that audiences cheered for it made Cornette even angrier. It proved that modern wrestling fans didn't care about the things he valued most. Number 8. Dixie Carter. Dixie Carter ran TNA Wrestling during some of its worst and most chaotic years. She was the boss. She made the final decisions. She controlled the money and the direction. And according to Cornette, every single one of those decisions was catastrophically wrong. Cornette's hatred for Carter is purely professional, but it runs incredibly deep. He saw her as an incompetent executive who had absolutely no understanding of the wrestling business. She inherited money and power from her family but had no knowledge of how to use them effectively. She ignored advice from veterans like Cornette, who had decades of experience. She made terrible creative choices that damaged the product. And worst of all, she enabled Vince Russo. Yes, we'll get to Russo later, and you'll see why that's so important. But Carter's decision to hire Russo and keep him in a position of creative power despite endless internal and external criticism became Cornette's biggest complaint about her leadership. She let Russo destroy TNA's creative direction while she smiled, nodded, and acted like everything was fine. She represented everything wrong with corporate wrestling, rich outsiders making decisions about a business they fundamentally don't understand. Cornette argues that TNA had potential. It had talented wrestlers, it had television deals, it had opportunities to become a real alternative to WWE. But Carter's incompetence squandered all of it. She threw money away on bad ideas. She trusted the wrong people. She refused to listen to the right people. And the company suffered because of it. For Cornette, attacking Carter serves a specific purpose. It lets him argue that his own failures in TNA weren't his fault. It allows him to shift blame upward to incompetent management. If only she had listened to him, TNA could have thrived and survived. But she didn't, and the company collapsed under her leadership, eventually becoming a shadow of what it could have been. Carter became a symbol of corporate mismanagement in wrestling. She's a warning to every wrestling promotion about what happens when you put someone in charge who doesn't understand or respect the business. She's proof that money alone can't save a wrestling company if the person spending it has no clue what they're doing. Number 7. Kevin Owens. Kevin Owens, then known as Kevin Steen, became a symbol of everything Cornette thought was wrong with modern wrestling's approach to star-making. During Cornette's time booking Ring of Honor, he envisioned a promotion built on elite athletes and technical excellence. He wanted ROH to be the alternative that showcased the best pure wrestlers in the world. Then he looked at Kevin Steen and saw the complete opposite of that vision. Steen was overweight. His physique didn't match the athletic standard Cornette demanded from his top stars. His style was brawling and hardcore, not the technical wrestling Cornette wanted to showcase. He didn't look like a champion in the traditional sense. He didn't carry himself like a mainstream star. And Cornette made his opinion brutally, publicly clear. Cornette famously said that Steen could only be a top guy if you're running a rec center with 100 to 200 people in it. Translation: Steen was fine for tiny independent shows in front of hardcore fans, but he would never make it to the big leagues. He lacked the look. He lacked the visual credibility. He would never be a main eventer on a national stage because mainstream audiences wouldn't accept him. This wasn't just casual criticism. Cornette was making a statement about what wrestling should be. He was drawing a line and saying that certain body types and certain styles don't belong in the main event picture. It was old school thinking applied to a modern situation, and it became a defining moment in the conflict between traditional wrestling values and new approaches. Then Steen became Kevin Owens. He signed with WWE. He became a champion multiple times. He main evented major shows. He became one of the most popular wrestlers in the company. He proved Cornette completely, undeniably wrong. But Cornette couldn't admit it. Instead of acknowledging that Owens succeeded, despite not fitting the traditional mold, Cornette doubled down on his criticism. He kept dismissing Owens' success. He kept pointing out his physique. He kept suggesting that Owens was an exception rather than proof that the rules had changed. Because admitting Owens was right would mean admitting his entire booking philosophy and decades of judgment were fundamentally flawed. Owens represents the vindication of the independent wrestler who doesn't fit the mold. He proved that you don't need the perfect body or the traditional look to succeed at the highest level. He proved that fans will accept you if you're talented enough, regardless of how you look. And that reality drives Cornette insane because it challenges everything he built his career believing. The feud also highlights Cornette's stubbornness. Even when faced with clear evidence that he was wrong, he refuses to adapt his thinking. That stubbornness is part of his brand, but it's also a limitation. It keeps him locked in the past, unable to acknowledge that wrestling has evolved beyond his narrow definition of what works. Number 6. John Moxley. John Moxley loves blood. He loves violence. He loves deathmatch wrestling and the extreme hardcore style that comes with it. And Jim Cornette thinks that makes him mentally unstable and dangerous to himself and the business. Moxley came from the independent scene where hardcore wrestling ruled supreme. Promotions like Combat Zone Wrestling built their entire reputation on dangerous, bloody spectacles that pushed the boundaries of what wrestling could be. Wrestlers used barbed wire, light tubes, glass, thumbtacks, and anything else that could cause pain and bleeding. The crowds loved it. The wrestlers became legends in that world. And Moxley thrived in that environment, making a name for himself as someone willing to go further than almost anyone else. Cornette sees this as a moral and professional failure. He argues that deathmatch wrestling is a race to the bottom. Wrestlers keep escalating the violence to shock audiences, but each escalation means less than the last. Eventually, you run out of ways to shock people, and all you're left with is permanent physical damage and shortened careers. The spectacle becomes the only thing that matters, and the actual wrestling gets lost. The hatred intensified dramatically when Cornette publicly questioned Moxley's mental health. He said Moxley didn't need rehab, he needed a mental evaluation. He questioned what was fundamentally wrong inside Moxley's head that made him crave violence and self-destruction. This wasn't just wrestling criticism. This was Cornette suggesting that Moxley had serious psychological problems that needed professional intervention. This criticism blends wrestling philosophy with genuine concern, but it comes across as cruel and invasive. Cornette positions himself as protecting wrestlers from themselves, as being the voice of reason in a business that's lost its mind. But he's also attacking Moxley's intelligence, sanity, and personal choices in a very public way. Cornette's argument is that this style of wrestling is unsustainable. Wrestlers who rely on blood and violence eventually destroy their bodies and end their careers prematurely. They sacrifice long-term health for short-term shock value. And promotions that feature this style are contributing to the problem by creating demand for increasingly dangerous content. But here's what bothers Cornette most: Moxley's success despite embracing deathmatch culture. Moxley became a world champion in AEW. He main evented major shows. He became one of the biggest stars in wrestling. He did all of this while continuing to incorporate blood and violence into his matches. That reality threatens Cornette's worldview because it proves that you can break all of his rules about safety and psychology and still become a major star. Cornette wants to believe that his way is the only sustainable path to success. He wants to believe that wrestlers who follow his rules will thrive and those who don't will fail. But Moxley's career proves otherwise. And that's unacceptable to Cornette, so he fights it with everything he has, including personal attacks on Moxley's mental state. Number 5, the Young Bucks. Matt and Nick Jackson, collectively known as the Young Bucks, represent modern wrestling's complete rejection of Jim Cornette's fundamental rules. They flip through the air constantly. They dive onto crowds of people. They choreograph elaborate sequences that look more like gymnastics routines than fights. And they refuse to sell exhaustion the way Cornette demands. They prioritize athleticism and spectacle over traditional psychology. And Cornette absolutely hates them for it. The feud goes back to Ring of Honor, where the seeds of hatred were planted. When Cornette booked ROH, he chose not to feature the Young Bucks consistently or push them as major stars. He claimed it was about logistics and costs, saying they were expensive to fly in and difficult to schedule. But the Bucks felt disrespected and dismissed. They complained backstage. They spread what Cornette calls lies about his treatment of them. The relationship soured permanently, and the bad blood has only intensified over the years. Cornette's core criticism is deceptively simple but philosophically important. The Young Bucks don't sell. In wrestling terminology, selling means acting hurt, tired, or damaged from your opponent's attacks. It's how you maintain believability in what you're presenting. If someone kicks you in the head, you should act like it hurt. You should slow down. You should show the effects. But the Young Bucks do flip after flip after flip, super kick after super kick, without showing any wear. They make wrestling look like a choreographed dance instead of a competitive fight. Cornette also hates their close relationship with wrestling journalist Dave Meltzer, who constantly praises them and gives their matches high ratings. Cornette sees Meltzer as another bad influence on modern wrestling, someone who values spectacle over storytelling and enables the very things Cornette fights against. The Young Bucks are Meltzer's favorite students, and that connection makes Cornette hate them even more. He calls them whiny piss babies who only care about irritating their critics and getting attention. He dismisses their success as a temporary trend that will eventually collapse when fans get tired of the style. He suggests they're more interested in being praised by their bubble of supporters than actually growing the business or creating sustainable success. But here's the truth that terrifies Cornette. The Young Bucks proved that you don't need his rules to succeed in modern wrestling. They built a massive following without adhering to traditional psychology. They made millions of dollars. They co-founded All Elite Wrestling, a company that directly competes with WWE. They became EVPs of a major wrestling promotion. They did all of this by doing everything Cornette said would fail. That's why the hatred is so intense and unrelenting. They're not just wrestlers he dislikes. They're living proof that his entire philosophy might be wrong. They're evidence that wrestling has evolved beyond his narrow definition of what works. And if they're right, then Cornette's decades of preaching about the right way to do things become meaningless. His entire legacy gets called into question. So Cornette can't let it go. He can't acknowledge their success. He can't admit they might have figured something out that he didn't understand, because doing so would undermine everything he stands for. Number 4, Kenny Omega. Kenny Omega is the ideological enemy. He represents everything Jim Cornette spent his entire career fighting against: comedy wrestling, video game references, over-the-top choreography that looks impossible, and worst of all, a complete and total disregard for traditional match psychology and believability. Cornette uses the term flippy-do to describe Omega's style, and it's meant as a cutting insult. It suggests that Omega's matches are just meaningless acrobatics with no story, no selling, and no internal logic. Cornette argues that Omega treats wrestling like a performance art or a gymnastics exhibition instead of a combat simulation. And for Cornette, that's the worst possible approach to wrestling. The most famous example that Cornette brings up repeatedly is what he calls the refrigerator spot. In Japan, during a promotion that featured comedy matches, Omega and another wrestler fought inside a house. At one point, Omega got thrown into a refrigerator. He disappeared inside it for several minutes. Then he popped back out, seemingly refreshed, and continued fighting like nothing happened. Cornette absolutely lost his mind over this. How is that realistic? How does that maintain the illusion of a real fight? How are fans supposed to take wrestling seriously when someone treats a refrigerator like a recovery chamber? It doesn't make sense. It's comedy. It's a joke. It's everything Cornette believes wrestling should never be. And the fact that fans loved it made him even angrier. Omega's success is completely undeniable. He main evented the Tokyo Dome, wrestling's most prestigious venue. He became AEW's first world champion. He's been called one of the best wrestlers in the world by fans and critics. Major wrestling publications rank him at the top of their lists, but Cornette refuses to acknowledge any of it. To admit that Omega succeeded while breaking every single rule would be to admit that the rules don't actually matter. So instead, Cornette doubles down harder than ever. He calls Omega a clown. He dismisses his achievements as overrated. He positions himself as the lone voice of truth-speaking while everyone else gets fooled by fancy moves and false praise from biased journalists. He suggests that Omega's fans don't actually understand what good wrestling is. The Omega hatred is also about what he represents for the future. If Omega's style is the future of wrestling, then Cornette's vision dies. If crowds continue to embrace comedy and acrobatics over realistic storytelling and psychology, then everything Cornette fought for becomes obsolete. The business moves on without him, and his principles get left behind as relics of a bygone era. Kenny Omega isn't just a wrestler Cornette hates. He's a symbol of the future Cornette refuses to accept. He's proof that wrestling can succeed by completely ignoring everything Cornette teaches. And that makes him an existential threat to Cornette's entire identity and legacy. Number 3, Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar is a physical monster. Everyone knows that. He's one of the most dominant wrestlers in history. He's a former UFC champion. He's a legitimate tough guy who could destroy almost anyone in a real fight. But back in the year 2000, when Lesnar was training in Ohio Valley Wrestling under Cornette's direct supervision, he was an absolute nightmare to manage. According to Cornette's many tellings of the story, Lesnar was arrogant beyond belief. He was insubordinate toward management. He treated OVW like it was beneath him, even though it was supposed to be his learning ground. He bullied lower-level staff members who couldn't defend themselves. He made referees cry through intimidation and cruelty. He created a toxic environment wherever he went. Cornette tried to manage him and teach him respect for the business, but Lesnar didn't care. He was cocky. He thought he knew everything. He believed his physical gifts meant he didn't need to follow the rules that applied to everyone else. And that attitude created constant friction with Cornette, who demands respect for authority and tradition. Then things got deeply personal, and the conflict escalated beyond anything else on this list. During a match, Lesnar performed a spot where he grabbed Cornette's wife, Stacy, in a very sensitive area. She had recently gotten piercings and had specifically, explicitly told Lesnar not to touch her there because it was still healing and painful. He did it anyway. It was a direct, intentional physical violation of someone Cornette loved. And whether Lesnar did it to be cruel or just didn't care about the warning, the result was the same. Cornette completely snapped. By his own detailed account told multiple times on his podcast, he confronted Lesnar backstage and threatened him with a gun. Yes, an actual firearm. Cornette claims he told Lesnar that if he ever disrespected his wife again, there would be severe consequences. Lesnar, despite his size and toughness, apparently backed down and apologized. This incident defines the absolute extreme limits of Cornette's commitment to backstage discipline and family protection. It's also a terrifying window into his temperament and how far he's willing to go. Cornette was willing to risk everything, including potential criminal charges and the complete destruction of his career, to defend his wife's dignity and punish someone who violated her. The hatred for Lesnar isn't about wrestling style or booking philosophy like many of the other feuds. It's deeply, intensely personal. It's about respect, boundaries, and the line between professional conduct and personal violation. Lesnar crossed that line in the worst possible way, and Cornette never forgave him for it. Interestingly, Cornette respects Lesnar's wrestling ability and acknowledges his success. He admits that Lesnar became one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. He recognizes Lesnar's legitimate toughness and athletic ability. But respect for talent doesn't erase hatred for behavior. And in Cornette's mind, what Lesnar did in OVW will always define him as someone who deserved to have a gun pointed in his direction. This story also reveals the danger of Cornette's old-school mentality. Threatening someone with a weapon, regardless of the provocation, is illegal and potentially deadly. It shows how Cornette's commitment to enforcing respect can cross into genuinely dangerous territory. But for Cornette, protecting his family justified any action, and he's never expressed regret about how he handled it. Number 2, Santino Marella. Santino Marella destroyed Jim Cornette's career with a single decision, and Cornette will hate him forever because of it. This feud represents Cornette's greatest professional failure and his inability to accept responsibility for his own actions. The year was 2005. Cornette was the head of Ohio Valley Wrestling, WWE's main developmental territory at the time. He had significant power, influence within WWE, and direct access to the company's future stars. He was in one of the most important positions in wrestling, shaping the next generation of WWE talent. Then came the incident that ended it all. During a backstage segment involving the Boogeyman, a ridiculous horror-themed character, Santino Marella laughed, or smirked, or showed some sign of amusement. The exact details vary depending on who tells the story, but Cornette saw it as a profound sign of disrespect. In his mind, Marella was mocking the business, breaking the sacred code of taking wrestling seriously, even when the gimmicks were absolutely ridiculous. So Cornette slapped him, hard, backstage in front of other people. It was a physical assault, plain and simple, regardless of the justification Cornette believed he had. Marella did what any reasonable person in the modern world would do. He reported the assault to WWE Human Resources. The company investigated the incident. They interviewed witnesses, they reviewed the situation, and they fired Cornette immediately. There was no debate. There was no second chance. Cornette was out. Cornette lost his position. He lost his power within WWE. He lost his direct connection to the company's talent pipeline. He lost years of built-up influence, all because he couldn't control his temper for one single moment. His career trajectory changed permanently because of one slap. The wrestling community largely agreed that Cornette was completely in the wrong. You can't physically assault your employees, no matter how disrespectful you think they're being. That's not how professional environments work anymore. But Cornette doesn't see it that way, and he never has. He blames Marella for snitching, for going to HR instead of handling it the old-school way, man to man. This hatred is psychologically complex and revealing. It forces Cornette to confront his own significant flaws, his uncontrollable temper, his inability to separate his on-screen intensity from backstage professionalism, his belief that physical intimidation is an acceptable management tool in a business that has evolved far beyond that approach. Rather than accept responsibility for destroying his own career, Cornette externalizes all the blame, makes Marella the villain in the story. He holds the grudge for nearly 2 decades. He brings it up constantly on his podcast because admitting that he was wrong would mean admitting that he destroyed his own position through lack of self-control and poor judgment. Cornette even went so far as to call Marella after he suffered a serious neck injury years later and tell him he was glad it happened. That level of sustained hatred and cruelty reveals something dark about Cornette's inability to let things go. He can't forgive. He can't move on. He can't acknowledge his role in what happened. Santino Marella represents Cornette's greatest failure, and hatred is so much easier than accountability. It's easier to blame someone else than to look in the mirror and admit you made a catastrophic mistake that you can never take back. Number 1. Vince Russo. This is it, the arch nemesis, the ultimate enemy, the final boss, the one person Jim Cornette hates more than anyone else in wrestling history, more than anyone else in any context, Vince Russo. The feud between Cornette and Russo isn't just personal. It's not just professional. It's ideological warfare on the grandest scale. It's a battle for the very soul of professional wrestling. And it's been going on relentlessly for over 25 years, with no signs of ever stopping. Russo was a wrestling writer during WWE's Attitude Era in the late 1990s. He helped create the Crash TV style that defined the era. Fast-paced, shocking, unpredictable, controversial. Ratings were huge during this period. WWE reached heights of popularity they'd never seen before. But Cornette saw something completely different when he looked at Russo's work. He saw the systematic destruction of everything wrestling was supposed to be. Cornette's criticism is specific, detailed, and absolutely devastating. He argues that Russo prioritized short-term shock value over long-term storytelling. Instead of building characters and feuds that paid off over months with satisfying conclusions, Russo created constant chaos that ultimately meant nothing. Titles changed hands constantly for no reason. Storylines started and stopped with no resolution. Nothing mattered because everything was designed solely to pop a rating for 1 week, with no thought given to next week or next month. Cornette blames Russo for destroying World Championship Wrestling. When Russo went to WCW as head of creative, the company collapsed within 2 years, going from WWE's main competition to completely out of business. Cornette blames Russo for destroying total nonstop action wrestling. When Russo joined TNA in a creative role, the promotion never recovered its early momentum and eventually became a shell of what it could have been. And Cornette blames Russo for diminishing his own influence within WWE during the Attitude Era, pushing out traditional voices in favor of shock value. But the feud went far beyond professional disagreements or creative philosophy. It became legal, public, and dangerous. Vince Russo filed a restraining order against Jim Cornette. He claimed that Cornette's constant verbal attacks and threats constituted stalking and harassment. Russo said he genuinely feared for his family's safety because some of Cornette's most extreme fans lived near him in Indiana, and he worried they might be influenced by Cornette's rhetoric to do something violent. Cornette's response was pure Cornette, and it revealed his genius for turning conflict into content. He mocked the restraining order publicly and repeatedly. He performed fake remorse on his podcast, sarcastically apologizing for scaring the little fella so bad. He read the legal document out loud for entertainment. And then brilliantly, he turned the restraining order into merchandise. He sold shirts featuring it. He used it as content for months. He transformed a genuine legal threat designed to silence him into a profitable piece of his brand. This is the genius and the madness of Cornette's approach. He took something that could have been embarrassing or limiting and made it into a weapon. He showed his audience that even when his enemies try to silence him through legal means, he'll turn their weapons into his tools. The restraining order became proof of how much Russo feared him, which only made Cornette look stronger to his fans. The Russo feud is absolutely essential to Cornette's identity and career. It's a meta-narrative about what wrestling should be at its core. If Russo's methods are ever validated as superior, then Cornette's entire life's work becomes meaningless. Every principle he stood for, every match he tried to protect, every tradition he fought to preserve would be proven wrong. His decades of experience would be shown to be outdated and irrelevant. So Cornette can never let it go. He can never forgive. He can never move on. He can never find common ground. Because the day he admits that Russo might have had a point, might have understood something about wrestling in the modern era, is the day his entire legacy crumbles into dust. Russo represents chaos versus order, modern versus traditional, short-term gains versus long-term health, shock value versus storytelling. And Cornette will fight that battle until his last breath, because losing it means losing everything he's built his life around. The intensity of this hatred has become profitable. Cornette's podcast thrives on Russo discussions. His fans tune in specifically to hear him destroy Russo. It's become a reliable content generator that never runs dry. And that's the ultimate irony. Cornette needs Russo to maintain his brand. The enemy has become essential to the business model. These 10 feuds define Jim Cornette's career as much as any of his legitimate accomplishments. They show a man who refuses to compromise under any circumstances, who burns bridges without hesitation, and who has turned hatred into a legitimate art form and business. Strategy. Some of these feuds were completely justified. Some were petty and unnecessary. Some were deeply personal. Some were purely ideological. But all of them reveal the same fundamental truth. Jim Cornette will never change. He will never adapt. He will never accept that wrestling might be bigger than his specific vision of what it should be. He will never acknowledge that there might be multiple valid approaches to the business. And that's exactly why his fans love him so intensely. He's the voice that says exactly what they're thinking. He fights the battles they want fought. He hates the people they hate. In a wrestling world that changes dramatically every single year, Cornette remains constant, angry, uncompromising, unwavering, and highly profitable. Whether you agree with him or think he's completely wrong, you can't ignore him. These 10 feuds prove that conclusively. From Dinsmore to Russo, from politics to guns to restraining orders to physical violence, Jim Cornette's hatred has shaped modern wrestling in ways nobody could have predicted when he started his career decades ago. And he's not done yet. The feuds continue. The hatred burns. The content keeps coming. Because for Jim Cornette, hatred isn't just an emotion. It's a business model. It's a brand. It's survival. If this video opened your eyes to how deep the Cornette rabbit hole truly goes, make sure you're subscribed because we're just getting started with this series. Next time, we're diving into the wrestlers who actually liked Cornette and supported his vision. And trust me, that list is way shorter and way more surprising. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me which feud shocked you the most and which one you think was most justified, and I'll see you in the next one.